Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. We're going to discuss open data internationally, and we're going to discuss France's stance in that context. We're very grateful to the three of you, Natalia, Mario, and Simon, for being with us today. Before I let you guys introduce yourselves quickly, I'm just going to go over a quick introduction on what we're going to touch on today, and then we'll go on to the questions. Just to introduce, an impact of open data is to bring transparency and data to civil society, and a new way of doing that is to assess and quantify open data maturity as a public policy. So it's really considering it as a public policy of its own. The rankings and assessments that are in place, they allow for comparison, they create opportunity for improvement for countries, they strengthen transparency, and they also open the door to appreciation for best practices and things that are well done. Today, our goal in this discussion will be to describe the current international open data landscape, and we'll do that through analyzing the comparison methods in place, so especially in the OECD and in the European Commission. We'll locate France within that, and then we'll try to understand how these rankings actually materialize for data users, so that this will be a more user-centric approach. So thank you so much for being with us. If you guys would each introduce yourselves, we could start with Natalia briefly, because we'll go over your work in the questions afterwards.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for hosting us here. My name is Natalia Rodstroy. I work for the Publications Office of the European Union based in Luxembourg, and in particular on data.europa.eu portal. And within the portal, as you know, perhaps that it's the portal who federates all the European data sets. And within the portal, I'm managing the open data maturity assessment exercise, which we will discuss today, in fact.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lucy. I'm Mario Restuccia. I'm a policy analyst at the OECD in the Public Governance Directorate, and more specifically in the Digital Government Unit, working on data, open data, and on the Our Data Index, which is our main measurement tool for open data policy and implementation. And I'm especially happy to be here because I used to work in DataGouv, so happy to be back and to see some familiar faces.
Thank you for being back. And now, Simon, if you would introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks for having me. So my name is Simon Chignard. I am the new chairman of Observatoire Data Publica. And just to explain in a few words what Observatoire Data Publica is, we are a non-profit, and our aim is to contribute to a better understanding of what and how local governments in France are using currently not only data, but also AI.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely try to look at that local perspective in the rest of the discussion. Before we try to locate France and understand how countries deal with public open data, we'll try to see how you actually rank and assess open data. So we'll start with discussing the tangible criteria and pillars used to evaluate public open data. So this question will be only for Natalia and Mario from a European Commission and OECD perspective. And I'd like you guys to explain to us, how does one assess countries on their public open data? What factors come into play when doing these assessments? We'll start with you, Mario, if that's okay.
Of course, thank you. So how do we do that? A great question. The OECD has been working on open data for more than 10 years by now. And as I mentioned, our main tool is the Open, Useful, and Reusable Data Index, Our Data Index, which is now at the 5th edition. We're currently working on the 5th edition, but I will only talk about the 4th, which came out in 2023. because we're still working on the fifth. So what do we measure in this index? There are three pillars: one on data availability, one on data accessibility, and one on government support for data reuse. And in all these three, that, as you can guess, they span between policy and implementation, and there's lots of stakeholder engagement. If we dive more in detail, there's once again a policy aspect, which is basically what the law says, what organizations in the government do to engage stakeholders, and how high-value datasets. In this case, I'm using a European Commission terminology, but we also call them high-value datasets, are shared, how they're available, the quality of the datasets, and this is particularly important because we want to see in the end is the impact, of course. So it's say the data cycle. We worked a lot on data policy with several recommendations that date back to 2014 and 2021, if I'm not mistaken. So our goal is to assess how our member countries and also non-member countries are implementing this and provide them with a tool to always do better. And happy to see that France in 2023 scored a very high score, being second just behind Korea. But let's see what happens at the next edition.
Yeah, we'll have an opportunity to discuss France's place later. And it's interesting that you talked about the high-value data sets. This gives out the floor to you, Natalia, on how in the Commission you guys assess countries.
Yes, so for the open data maturity assessment, we have this year 10th edition, the anniversary edition of the exercise. It is a self-assessment survey which European countries are participating in, so member states and beyond. And we are measuring open data maturity based on 4 dimensions, so-called dimensions. There are 14 indicators and 136 questions on policy dimension, meaning we are looking at what policies are applied in the countries, whether there are open data strategies, and how the implementation of open data is set up. Then we are looking at the dimension of portal, meaning portal features, portal sustainability criteria, but also how portals engage with the users and whether they have analytics. And then we are looking at open data quality, meaning mostly the metadata quality. So we'll look at the standards and metadata standards with a particular focus on the European vocabulary for exchange of metadata, which is DCAT-AP so-called profile. Whether there are monitoring in place for open data metadata quality, and whether there are also standards, like, for example, maybe FAIR applied to data sets. And then the last but not least is the impact dimension, one of the most difficult maybe to measure, but one of the most important ones, because it's about the value of open data that they are supposed to create. And we looked actually whether the countries have per se the definition established of the impact, whether there are frameworks and monitoring mechanisms in place, and also something more tangible. We are collecting from each country real use cases reported by the users or just collected by the countries in different domains of impact, such as, for example, environmental or societal impact.
That's very interesting.
So this is brief as the framework, yeah.
Sure. That's very interesting. And it's interesting that the two of you used the impact as one of the main pillars in evaluating, because it's definitely why open data has a value. And as a country that participates in both of these rankings, we can go on to the second topic, which is France's place and how it compares. Because as you said, Mario, France reached the second place of the OECD ranking and then the first for the European Commissions. And I wanted us to discuss what France's strengths are and weaknesses compared to other countries in terms of public open data. And I'd like for us to start with a user-centric perspective. So Simon, if you would like to give us your opinion as an observer of data and open data.
Yes, thanks, Lucy. Well, actually, I think that basically in the past few years, I traveled a lot in Europe and meeting people in different countries, such as Germany, Spain, or the UK. And at some point, and discussing how open data is going in their own country. And at some point, I realized how much being a centralized country, because France is a centralized country compared to Germany or Spain or Belgium, for instance. Being a centralized country is really, really a huge asset when it comes to open data. Just to give you an overview, for instance, if you go to Germany, which is a really great country and very powerful economically, but still they don't have so many strong national centralized data producers as we have in France. And for that reason, I think that's one of the main strengths of France is the fact that we are a centralized country. And actually, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Natalia and Mario, but let me know if I am wrong, but I guess that the top countries in Europe or at the EU city level, when it comes to open data, are more centralized than decentralized or federalism. You know, it came as a joke when I meet my friends in Germany, in Berlin every year. They say, and when I ask them, how is it going with your open data at the national level? They say, well, you know, Simon, federalism, such as it should be an explanation for everything. I guess that's not federalism, that's still. And that's, I think, the user perspective. Maybe just one more thing. I'm not so sure that rankings are as much important for data users than they are for data producers. I remember working at Etana 10 years ago, and I remember clearly that gaining ranks in the top rankings were really, really a huge incentive on data producers themselves, in a way that we said to data producers such as the statistical office or the geographical information office, okay, you know, if you want France to be on the top 3, then you really need to open up and you really need to release the company register or other big and huge data sets.
That's very interesting, the incentive and the decentralization part. Mario, if you want to react to that, would you give France different strengths and weaknesses, or do you agree with what Simon just said?
It's an interesting point, the one on federalism, because if I look at the scores from 2023 from the OECD, I would say there's not much difference because we do not measure the performance at sub-national level. And if I have to look at one country, for example, Canada, which is a very federalized country, we do not look into what the provinces in their case are doing. And a counter example, if I might, is also that France, at the local level, in my experience, does a great job. And the DataGouv team does a great job at harvesting all the subnational portals. That there's lots of work behind that, which actually goes in a direction that, to me, at least on open data, of course, looks more federal, even in the sense that the level of independence of the national authorities in France on open data is so high that you actually have to do lots of effort as if you were a federal country. So in the case, it depends quite a lot. I don't know if from the EU perspective, there is some other difference since you measure some other aspects that we do not consider.
We are also not measuring at the local level. However, we are aware of exactly Simon points you are bringing while we are talking with the countries. And for example, it can be that in Germany, let's say, for instance, there could be initiatives at local level which are very mature, and they can be even more mature than some more centralized, let's say, initiatives like national portal and so on. So there is definitely a field where there can be knowledge exchange and learning in such countries. And we are also looking in general at governance in countries. We find it's very interesting aspect because depending on how the governance is set in the country. So for example, central or federal, it's one aspect of the governance, but then there can be more aspects to it. It has a very big influence on open data in general. So actually studying a little bit more in detail how the open data topic is governed, and it can depend on many factors as size of the country, of course, and how it is internally organized. And sometimes open data topics, from what we see, can be allocated also within different ministries. Actually, that's the case. And many actors are playing a role, so that makes a big difference in fact. And regarding rankings for data users, indeed, rankings, I would say, are more to push the open data maturity in the countries forward, because frameworks actually serve as a kind of agenda, what could we do to improve the maturity and quality of data. So users are benefiting indirectly from this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, on my side, if I might add, that's also why we do this. I mean, it's not just to look how our country scores with respect to the others, but it is a tool for the governments, of course, so the central unit responsible for open data. But then if you make it cascade down to all the entities actually producing data, giving the examples, the use cases, and so on, then of course you score high on stakeholder engagement, but then eventually the quality will be high. So the users, as Simon said, and as also Natalia agreed, would be happy.
And maybe just one point on company registers, which Simon mentioned, and in relation to high-value data sets mentioned by Mario, because indeed, maybe we might operate with different terms. So one of important aspects that we are measuring are, of course, linked to, in general, EU data policies, which are giving us a big part of the indicators finally we are looking at. And recently, the high-value data sets, in terms of how the Commission defines the list of them, is also measured via open data maturity. Exercise and company registers, as you might know, are on the list of high-value data sets. So something really important for countries now to work on, because it's one of the most difficult domains. Many of company registries are still non-open data, for example.
Thank you.
If I just
Of course.
may add,
Of course.
just one word on that, because that's interesting that Natalia is mentioning high-value data set, because actually, if I remember right, 10 years or 12 years ago, the first ranking, the one from Open Knowledge Foundation, was just a list of 10 high-value data sets. And it's interesting to see how rankings evolve, also integrating new dimensions, as you said, at the EU level, 4 dimensions. And every year, I think it's easier and give us a better understanding of how each country is doing, not just looking at how many data sets are open or just looking at high-value data set, but having a more broad and more comprehensive approach.
That's a great transition onto our next talking point. Different countries have, their specificities, their political particularities, or technical abilities as well. And I wanted us to try to go through some best practices that you each have noticed in your respective realms. So countries that do something that's maybe not having those specific data sets, but having a great portal or things like that. I'd like for us to start with you, Mario, in your OECD region, and then we'll go to Natalia for the European Commission. But I'd like for you guys not to talk about France so that we can give other examples of different countries. And then I'll ask Simon to react from a more French perspective.
But I want to talk about France, but first because one of the points that I've been noticing recently, once again, we're still evaluating the next edition of the index, so there's not much to share about it. But the change that you made on DataGo.fr of implementing APIs, even the closed access ones, this is a trend that we've been noticing over the years in various portals. Thinking about Sweden, for example, has been doing it for a while, which is eventually the direction where countries are heading towards, in the sense of facilitating the access and the sharing of data that goes beyond the open one, and this eventually makes it more usable, just simply because it is the same as kind of data that is used by the administration, by private entities, and also by the public. This is something that countries have been more issues, let's say, in the past years implementing, of course, because it requires technical skills and efforts at every step. But we have been seeing an increase in the aspect in 2023, and is, I think, the direction that we hope that will be developed even more.
Absolutely. And you guys also ask for data to be accessible through API, so you're also playing in that incentive of getting different accesses. Natalia, in the European standpoint, from the European standpoint, do you have examples of best practices?
Yes, I just would like to fully agree on this point with Mario, because it's also what we are observing, that for us, so-called protected data is getting closer to open data. And again, it's difficult not to speak about France, because I think you are also one of the countries who is experimenting and applying not only this concept, but also looking at infrastructure behind how it could be done in a secure way. But also we observe it indeed in other countries, that at least they are speaking about it and conceptualizing how to bring this to different, let's say, data sets on openness level together. So it is going more into the direction of data sharing. But then we can see the bunches of countries focusing on different aspects. So for example, there are countries who are focusing in recent years, maybe a little bit more on developing frameworks for measuring impact. And you didn't want that I mentioned France, but again, it's difficult because you are one of the countries. But also Slovenia, Sweden, and Finland are going into this direction. So establishing their frameworks for measuring impact of open data. Other countries, like for example, Denmark is a very good example of it, are focusing on the quality and standards. So really putting standards and quality before the quantity, and they are doing it very clearly. And then other countries are maybe more focused now on establishing vivid communities via a lot of events, participative projects to engage users.
Thank you. Simon, if you would react to those different ideas, do you feel like they echo with the French example? Do they not? Have you seen similarities with that?
I think I fully agree with what Mario and Natalia said, especially on maybe the idea of having not only open data, but also shared data. And it comes back to a publication by the ODI a few years ago about the data spectrum. And I think we are fully relying on that in France. Maybe just adding one thing that I didn't heard so far, the social dimension of data. I think that France and Data Group has put a lot of effort in developing communities of data users, and not only communities, but also tools and verticals such as transport.data.gouv.fr or ecology.data.gouv.fr. And I think that's one of the specificities of France, actually.
That is very interesting, and you guys are very kind to speak about France when I asked for different examples, but thank you for that free promotion. I wanted now us to try and see public open data as a whole. You all study and work with very different countries, and I wanted you guys to maybe answer this question. Have you noticed overall emerging trends that everyone has been following maybe more globally? And I wanted us to start maybe with Natalia from a European standpoint. Do you think public data is going in a specific direction, maybe in looking at different data use cases with AI and stuff? Do you feel like that's evolving?
Exactly, you named it. So I would say it's going into the direction of what we said with data sharing. So at European level, we are speaking about data spaces, but it is about data sharing. So infrastructures that can communicate with each other and exchange data in certain domains, like for example, health data space. Seamlessly. And then, of course, for AI, what we can see, and we saw it in the recent meeting with the countries, some countries started to experiment with applying AI for discoverability purposes. So you can imagine use cases like, for example, adjusting the descriptions in an automatic way of data sets. Basically, it can serve the harmonization. So I suppose that more and more experiments into this direction will be going, because it is still difficult. In terms of metadata, everybody has a different way to assign metadata, especially the free text metadata, which are titles and descriptions. So for users, it is still difficult sometimes to not only find data sets, but even to understand what are the data sets about, actually. And maybe the AI can help with this free text information, which is very important as an entrance point for the users, or categorizing with vocabularies, helping with standards. So we can imagine many use cases. So that's definitely there to play a role.
Thank you. Mario, on that, from the OECD standpoint, are these the same trends? Are there different ones in different countries that maybe are further from Europe?
Yeah, absolutely the same trends. Yes, of course. Without going too much into detail for data spaces, on the AI aspect, that's particularly relevant. We've been working with my team a lot on this topic, and there will be a publication on AI coming up next week, if I'm not mistaken, which will be a flagship report on how countries are using AI, and there's, of course, a large need for datasets for training models, especially if you want to build your own models in-house, and that's what countries are looking at. And if I'm not mistaken, DataGouv was doing this with a series of data sets for machine learning. I don't know if that's still an initiative that is on, but it goes in this direction of not just releasing data for one person to reuse, but you have to train a model on it, and that requires high quality of really how the data is structured, how the file is structured. So it requires a lot more work than just publishing an Excel file or a CSV. You really need proper documentation, and everything has to be perfect. Because in the end, it's more on the machine readable aspects in the purest sense. So this is something that I think we will see more of this in the coming years, and it requires from our side, let's say the measurement side, lots of careful work in assessing all the aspects. We talked about companies, registries, which is one of the categories for us as well, and that's exactly one great point. We just don't want PDF. Yeah, we don't want a CSV file. There should be an API. You should be able to plug it into your model, and then from there you can go on reusing the data at, let's say, the maximum extent possible. So then, of course, it intertwines with the policy and so on. This is something that comes from the user side quite a lot, and we see a trend of countries being the first reusers of data in a way that is new, in a way that's more of, I build my models, I train it on some open data sets that I can find, and I see what happens. This is not something countries have been doing until now, I think, and it's all up to what you will do with the quality of data available.
Right before we get your reaction, Simon, I wanted to ask a counter question. Have you noticed countries that weren't very participative in open data that, due to these new use cases, are starting to focus more on data quality? Like, have you actually seen a change, or is it just countries that were already participating that are fine-tuning their open data with these new use cases? Is it a different population, or is it just evolution? And then Simon, will go to you. Natalia or Mario, whichever one of you wants to pick up on that.
I can maybe say that we see evolution in data quality in certain domains, maybe quicker than in others. So I would say that environmental domain and maybe transportation as well, mobility, but environmental in particular, there is indeed also more regulation at one hand, but because of huge interest in climate and monitoring and so on, there are more efforts in this area. In all countries, actually. And here we can also say about the trend about regarding the real-time data, which is important for the environmental and climate monitoring. And indeed, there are efforts at local and national level to make these data sets open.
Thank you. Mario?
From the OECD side, I say it's difficult to talk about some trends on the level of the country. We will see some, I guess, curious results in the next edition of the index with some great use cases. But the aspect that I've been noticing looking at the 2023 edition is that the second mover advantage, so coming after the ones that have been leading 10 years ago, can be useful in many times, but we should not look into this only from the country's point of view, because within the country, the producers are so heterogeneous. I mean, you know that. So you might have the central government unit responsible for open data that is way ahead, but then the agency in charge of geographical data or crime data or weather data that is way behind. And it does not depend on the country. I mean, there's no silver bullet on this. You see it in France. You've been doing a great work with weather data recently. That is super important, but was not open until some time ago. That's a great example. We see this across all the countries, and it needs leadership, it needs training, it needs users asking for it, and let's see, maybe we'll have some good examples to share soon.
Thank you. Simo, I'll let you react. I know that there's a lot of thoughts. If you would please also give us your expertise on the local level in France. I'd be very interested in that and how that compares to these examples. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, actually, I see two trends emerging. The first one, of course, is AI, but we're going to discuss that later. And coming back to the second one, actually, and it's linked to the data sharing approach. The question is, should we include personal data? And actually, usually we say that personal data is out of the scope of open data, but if we speak about data sharing and data sharing between governments, between local governments and national governments, or inside local governments and national governments, it makes sense to think about infrastructure and rules to enable the sharing of personal data for public interest. So that's the first trend. And usually it's totally out of scope. What I mean, it's different infrastructure, different teams managing that, and that's interesting to see maybe both approach converging. And the second one, of course, is AI, but maybe with a slightly different approach between what I would say and what Mario and Natalia said. Actually, I see AI as a game changer for many different reasons. One is that we had a first period when we used to publish data sets on open data portals. Then we added API for enabling data software engineer to integrate data and so on. But nowadays, if I am a machine learning engineer, I'm not going to data.gov.uk or data.gov.fr. I'm going to Hugging Face. And that's a different way to consume data and open data. And maybe that's also a change in the ecosystem itself. Not only because on Hugging Face I will find data set, but I will also find an infrastructure and tools and pre-trained models and so on and so on. And coming back to your question about the local level, actually, I forgot to mention that one of the strengths of France, I guess, is that we have open data is quite strong at the national level, but it's also quite strong also at the local level. Even though we should be careful when we speak about the local governments, because there is a strong difference between municipalities and regions. For instance, regions are very keen on open data, but that's not the case for the smaller communities and municipalities in France.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. The last question that I had before we open the discussion to the public, and I feel like we've already touched on this, so I'll tweak it around a little bit. The question was going to be what's next for open data, but we've talked about restricted access to restricted data. We've talked about APIs. We've talked about a whole lot of new things. We've talked about AI. My question is open data completely changing? Including APIs, including restricted data, completely changes the framework of open data, which used to be, accessible data. Have you noticed that, in your personal opinion, do you have an idea where we're going specifically? Do you think that regulation is going to completely change? Do you think that countries are going to change their, just like an open question on what you think is next for what we call today open data, but might not fully be open data tomorrow. Maybe we'll start with Mario for this one.
Good point. I don't think we're done with open data. I think all that we talk about builds upon it. So to talk about sharing of what's private data or data that cannot be openly shared, you need infrastructure, as Simon said. You need also to maybe start from the basics of opening the CSV file. So I don't think that the push for something new would make us forget the basics, because the basics is what we build the system on, and we see that. I mean, that is infrastructure. But that's I'm not saying anything new here. So what we will, I think, see in the future is again more precision. I think on how this subject is approached, and not only from a point of view of transparency, which has been the perspective for many years, but more from, I mean, the classical example is what we've been doing with the transport data. To take something, you make it a part of the infrastructure. You talk with users about it. You talk with private companies, and you make it so there is no situation which is just an exercise of sharing a file on a website, but it is as important as the physical infrastructure on which trains run. You also need the GTFS file, and you put it at the same level. Then, of course, on top of that, we can talk about private data and what administrations need, and so on and so forth. But the basics, once again, are important, and maybe this need to be covered fully before thinking about the next steps. So without skipping something because of AI or because of API or secure sharing, we need to solidify still.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Data has become a necessity for companies and for states and for local governments, and that it's an incentive for quality and for accessibility, etc. Natalia, what is your open question answer to this? What is next for open data?
I would see it in a similar line actually with Mario. So I think it will be, as always, going a bit in parallel. So some more advanced countries will start experimenting also with new things, like really how to manage, for example, different user rights when we speak about data sharing and so on. But even if the maturity level is very high, because in the last open data maturity assessment, we saw that average was by 83% for member states countries, there is still a lot of, not homogeneous approaches, and the local level is still often, in certain sense, maybe not as advanced as the national level. So I think many parallel still movements will be going on. But from our point of view, high-value datasets, for example, maybe that's also a difference to other lists. It came with certain requirements that they have to be made available via APIs and with documentation under open licenses and with certain data standards inside of it. And maybe the list of these high-value data sets potentially would be extended in the future, we can imagine. And we see that making already these changes, like APIs availability for data sets, so not for the portal, we are not speaking about the portal having API, but API on top of the data. It is already a huge step in investment for countries. So we will stay for a while with these elements. Same regards data standards. So it's difficult to speak about good reusability or even for AI purposes, without having better standards, cleaner data, and also interoperable ones. Because for the future, from the point of view of supranational platforms or websites, for example, data.europa.eu, but there might be many others, also one mentioned by Simon. Still, for the interoperability purposes, in order to find meaningful data, it's very difficult across countries right now, because each country is speaking a little bit their own language, even if VCAT AP is more and more applied, and France also applied VCAT AP, but it's metadata, and at the data level, it's much more difficult. So I would see many parallel developments, let's say, working on the grounds and foundations, which are important, and experimenting with new things, definitely.
Thank you. Simon, if you would like to react to all that.
Yeah, maybe for the future, I see two different directions, actually not contradictory, but maybe more complementary. The first one, coming back to what Mario said, I fully agree on the idea of data as infrastructure. And actually, that was the title of a report of the French CDO a few years ago. And one of the characteristics of infrastructure is that it's not visible. And it should not be visible. I mean, you don't really know where your energy distribution network is until it breaks. And maybe in the future, it's going to be exactly the same. We don't really know who makes this data available, but still it's there and we can rely on, and so on and so on. So that's just one trend, and maybe one totally different direction will be to do. I guess that in the future, we'll see more open data aiming directly for social change. That is saying, okay, we in our country, we face big societal issues, climate change, poverty, health issues in certain neighborhoods, and so on and so on. And maybe open data is a very good, not really a solution, but a tool to find a solution or to make everything on the table and to say, okay, this is how the situation is, how can we find new solution, and so on. So as you can see, two different directions. One saying, okay, open data is meant to be totally invisible. And the second one saying, no, we really want to do open data, but for a good reason.
Absolutely. And this resonates with a question that was put in the chat. It's more of a remark than a question, but they say that maybe the local actors are closer to the human impact that is induced by open data, as they are intervening on a smaller territory and more directly in touch with the citizens from which the data is drained. So this comment definitely goes towards what you're saying, and also with this local perspective of that, you know, if data is made locally with a social or, you know, public policy aim in a way that people understand, they're also more eager to participate.
Yeah, fully agree on that. And actually, a good topic is climate change, because as you know, if we really want to tackle climate change, we need to share data, not only data produced by local governments, but also data produced by national agencies and data produced by the private sector. So that's typically one topic we should aim for: more openness and more sharing.
And another open question, this one is mine and not from the comments. How could we do that? How could we improve this interoperability between all these different actors? Does this match the data spaces that Europe is offering? Is it another solution? Is it legislation? Maybe we'll go to Mario first.
Legislation is one tool, of course, but then if you just have the policy and you do not implement it correctly, then it leads to nowhere. Stakeholder engagement, absolutely. Data literacy training, and really having it as part of, not only as part of the training for the public servants, of course, on the aspects of using it, or publishing data, but also on reusing it. So that's where you really make the difference. And I think that's also why, if I look into the categories of high-value data sets that are better, let's say, that are more available across OECD countries, statistical data is the highest, because statisticians have been doing this for a long time. And on the other hand, if you look at other types of data about, for example, government finances, they are not as open, but they're high quality. Accountability and justice, there is quite a difference. So once again, maybe the policy is there. What do you do with it? Do you reach out to people that are responsible for implementing it, and you bring them towards a correct implementation? You accompany them, or you just let the legislative aspects do it? This is something that also countries approach in a very different way. So there is, once again, also here no silver bullet to address the question. But we see that, for example, at EU level, the high value assets regulation creates a very strict standards in terms of some technical aspects of what data sets should be even about. So maybe this is the way. I don't know. How is it going in the EU with respect to that?
Right before you answer, Natalia, if people in the public are interested in high value data sets, we have another webinar on HVDs next week. It's on the 17th, and we'll have 3 or 4 data producers for high value data sets in France who will be presenting their data and how they reached the standards and everything. So that if that interests you, it'll be in French, but it's on the 17th, and all the info is on our social media. That was our quick little promo. Natalia, how do you feel about what we just said?
From what we saw, and when we talked with countries, indeed, high-value datasets regulation helped in many ways to push opening up of datasets. So it is an instrument, but we also see that, peer learning and networks, not only within the country, but between the countries is very important. As always, it is a bit difficult to organize because of time and so on, of people who are working in public administration, but when we have gatherings like data providers, workshops, we see that it is very impactful for people working on open data. So this direct exchange of knowledge is very important, and I think can bring a lot of value actually in improving the situation. The same happens with communities. Maybe it is even more difficult to engage with many communities. But this is this user-centric perspective, which we're all talking about, and it's a bit more difficult to organize, but I think it's equally important. So it's like both, the networks and really human factor plays, I would say, same role as technologies and infrastructures behind. They go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Simon, do you have any ideas on how that could evolve?
Maybe just to add one thing, every year we at the Observatoire Data Publica, we also try to do an opinion survey and asking the population in France how confident they are with the use of their data by the public sector and the private sector. To be honest, the results are not so great, and there are only 1/3 of the population that consider that they are well informed about what the public sector is doing with their data. And that's really a concern, and maybe something that we should really focus on during the next year. We used to talk about a lot about transparency and open data as a transparency mechanism, but we need also more transparency on the use of data itself. And I am convinced that if we don't look at this issue now, it's going to be more and more a problem in the coming years.
It's a very interesting thought. There was another question in the chat, but I feel like we discussed this before, but let's see if you guys have reactions to that. What strategic recommendations do you propose to enhance the interoperability of digital infrastructures, ensuring the seamless flow of open data while accounting for territorial specificities and local constraints? So a big question to say, how do we go towards interoperability without, losing the specificity and with working teams who have their local priorities? Does that inspire any reactions from you guys?
Maybe first what comes into my mind that it can be that certain data, like for example, statistic or geospatial, they have their own, let's say, vocabularies and standards. That's one point. But another is common metadata, for example, for discoverability purposes or for understanding what these data sets are about. And here we would say we just need to apply really same standards or interoperable standards.
That's interesting.
Like, for example, for metadata, DKTP, but same regards data standards for each domain, like procurement or transportation and so on.
Yes, I feel like, again, we're trying to deal with the national or the bigger scale with their, dealing with the specificities and making something interoperable while working with the smaller scale local governments and stuff. So it's both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. We're kind of trying to do the two at the same time to figure it out. Mario or Simon, does that inspire any reaction from you guys?
On my side, totally. I mean, I agree with Natalia. Yes, set standards, follow the standards, and accompany people to follow the standards. Build tools that make it easy because it should not be an effort. And special mention to schema.its.go.fr for doing that, even if it's just at national level in most aspects. But that's really how you do it, and we can see that happening in some fields. We can see that it's often pushed by regulation like at the EU level, which is great. But then once again, the implementation aspect should also be mostly bottom up, because otherwise it's just a text of law that forces you to use a obscure standards that no one will follow. No one wants that. Which should be, a cycle of data reuse that then fits back into what the producer is doing.
Simon, do you want to react to that, or should we?
Well, just to say that basically the relationship between local and national governments it's complicated, to say the least, when it comes to that point. Standardization, of course, and I fully agree with Mario and Natalia, it's a way to achieve that interoperability. But still, we have to manage different expectations and the fact that sometimes in certain local governments, certain territories, it makes sense to collect and to publish some data that is very specific to the municipality, and that's not the case for another one. So it's really complicated. And what I have seen so far is that standardization is a way to achieve that. Regulation and the law is another way to achieve that. Maybe trying a different approach would be to focus on the reuse, on reusers themselves. That is to say, okay, whatever the way you publish your data, whatever, until you use the correct standard and scheme, you're free to do whatever you want, but still we want to make sure that everyone at the country level would be able to access the same data. And that's really complicated.
Absolutely.
Maybe just to add here, what we also observed is putting standards out there is sometimes not really helpful for many actors because it is too difficult. Even if it's maybe a very basic standard, it can be still too difficult or unclear how to apply it. So what could help are best practices examples within the country, and I would say still like knowledge sharing and learning from each other, or just sharing examples of how to do it, because many administrations would struggle. For example, they wouldn't have maybe technical expertise in applying standards. They would need somehow to translate it in very basic terms what exactly needs to be done.
Thank you. Right before we close up, there was one last remark in the chat that I will share. It's when we were talking about data use and how the public isn't really aware of what their data are being used for. Someone said the public actors are very dependent on international and private firms in terms of data conservation and the security behind that. So that was a last remark from someone in the chat. I think maybe we should wrap up. Thank you so much to the three of you for being here today. This was such an interesting conversation. I'm really glad that we got to have that. I hope that this was interesting for the people in the chat as well. So if anyone is interested in the different works that the three of you do, there's works from the OECD, the Publications Office for the European Commission, and then l'Observatoire Data Publica. That is all online. And if this conversation made you curious about high-value data sets or standardization or things like that, we have other webinars coming up in the next 3 months, because it's a 3-month event, discussing these. We're focusing on access to data, circulation of data, and then use of data. So there'll be opportunities to talk about everything. But thank you again for being here, Natalia, Mario, and Simon. This was wonderful, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And
Bye.
just to invite also people to go to the website of Data.Europe to discover, because we have also a new tool for open data maturity assessments. So using this occasion to invite everybody to look at it.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Mario and Simon, do you also want to share something before we log off?
Not not yet, but follow what we're doing, and next year we'll share quite a lot on data and digital government.
We're looking forward to that. Thank you all so much. Have a great
Bye-bye.
afternoon.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye. Bye.